All right, so we're here at the famous Union Club, haunts of someone everyone knows in Cleveland and around the country and even the world. Everyone knows the name Dick Pogue, of course. Usually they precede that with something like the Legendary Dick Pogue or, simply Mr. Cleveland. So we get to chat with you today and talk a little and see how you became this Dick Pogue persona. So tell us, where you were born and your early family life.
Okay, I was born in Cambridge, right outside of Boston. My father was a lawyer with the law firm Ropes and Gray there. And very shortly after that, the firm decided to open an office in Paris. And so my family, including me, went to Paris and spent my first 2 years over there.
Wow.
Then we came back and lived in New York City for a while.
Do you remember any of Paris? I mean, you were too young, right?
I'm sorry?
Do you remember any of the Paris days? You were too young,
No.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, I've been told that when I was in France, I spoke partly French and part English.
Wow.
And on the boat coming back, nobody could understand me because I had such gibberish. But so then we moved to New York City. My father practiced law there, and then Summit, New Jersey. And then in 1938, Congress passed the Civil Aeronautics Act, which for the first time regulated airlines, commercial airlines. And he went down and knocked on the door and asked for a job as a young lawyer and got it.
Wow.
And within 3 years, he was chairman of the CAB, the Civil Aeronautics Board. So during all that time, I lived in Chevy Chase, Maryland, right outside the district, and went to public schools there. And I, as a 10th grader, I went to BCC, Bethesda Chevy Chase High School, and I decided I wasn't learning much there, so I was entitled to go to a school in the District of Columbia because my father had a job there as CAB chairman. So I transferred and went to Woodrow Wilson High School, which in those days was regarded as one of the 20 best public high schools in the country. And it was a wonderful experience, and got a terrific couple of years there. And then a friend of mine, I was busy on activities and so forth and wasn't paying much attention to college. And one of my friends, his father was a Cornell University alumnus, and he told me about this new scholarship they were offering. And I wasn't paying much attention, but just to please him, I said I'd apply for this scholarship. And I got it, and it was all tuition plus quite a bit of cash.
Wow.
So I went to Cornell for no reason other than to please my friend's father. And it turned out to be a very nice experience. In fact, last week I went there for my 75th college reunion.
Wow.
Because I graduated from college in 1950. So that's my background.
I read a story somewhere, I don't know if it's true or not, but you weren't, when you went to Cornell, and you weren't infatuated with becoming a lawyer right away. You actually were looking at becoming a sports writer or something. Is that true? Tell me about that.
Yeah, well, there was a famous sports writer from the New York Times, John Kiernan. He was a great writer, and I wanted to emulate him. But when I graduated, I wasn't quite ready, so I thought, well, I'll go to law school and spend a little time, and then I can do that later. So I went to Michigan Law School.
You know how different this city and this world would be if you had become a sports writer instead of Mr. Cleveland? That's hilarious. So, okay, you went to Michigan Law School.
Yeah.
And then you did something with the Army.
Yeah, well, in those days, in the 1950s, the Korean War was on, and there was a draft, and I wanted to be drafted and go in and spend a couple of years and then get out. But I was engaged to who became my wife later, and she said, no, you got to make a little money, and you got to apply for a commission. So I did. I applied for Army, JAG, Judge Advocate General Corps, and got the commission. I knew nothing about the Army. I bought a used uniform from a surplus store.
Oh, kidding.
I showed up on January 1 of 1954 at the Pentagon, and in this rumpled uniform, and didn't shine my shoes or anything. And the first morning I was there, my commanding officer said, T-JAG, the Judge Advocate General, is getting his third star this morning, and he's entitled to 2 guests, and he doesn't want to pick among the colonels for political reasons, so he's inviting his wife and the junior member of the Corps, and that's you.
Wow.
So I go down to General Matthew Ridgway's, he was the top dog, office, and there are 31 generals in this General Ridgway's office, and me. And I was really humiliated because I wasn't dressed properly and so forth, but that was quite a start to my Army career.
So we've heard about a bunch of different cities, you know, in Cambridge and Chevy Chase and DC and up in Ann Arbor and even Paris. But how'd you get to Cleveland?
Well, I had 3 years in the Pentagon. I had written an article on patents, which was cited by the U.S. Supreme Court, and that's how I was found out by Alan Holmes. He was a partner at Jones Day, and he was a Michigan law grad. And while I was in the Army, I had plenty of spare time in the evenings, so I wrote a case book on antitrust law, and he was an antitrust lawyer, and he found out about me, and every time he'd come to Washington on business, we'd have lunch, and he'd tell me about this great law firm in this great city of Cleveland. I was paying no attention to any of it, but finally I said to my wife, look, let's just cut this off. Let's go out to Cleveland for a weekend and then say goodbye. And so we came out here for a weekend, had a fabulous time, met a lot of great lawyers in the firm, and at the end of the weekend, I said to my wife, well, why don't we sign up for 5 years at Jones Day, and then we'll move on to New York or Chicago or someplace. And so I agreed, and I'm still here.
Wow. And she went along with that? I mean, neither of you knew Cleveland.
She was from Ohio. She was
okay.
From Bowling Green, Ohio, so this was good news to her.
So did you meet her at school in Michigan?
Okay.
Did you meet her at school in Michigan?
Yeah, she was at Michigan when I was at law school.
Okay. And you know, you're saying Jones Day, but back then, the other 2 names after Jones Day, what was that?
Jones Day, Copley, and Reavis.
Okay.
And the managing partner was Jack Reavis, and he was a tremendous guy. Actually, his father, he came from Nebraska, where my mother came from, and his father ran for Congress against my grandfather.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Out in Nebraska.
So you joined. You came over here, give it a 5-year shot before, you know.
I'm sorry?
You give it a 5-year shot
Yeah.
in Cleveland, and
Yeah.
always. Yeah. And you became a partner then. And what was your principal field of practice?
Well, that was another interesting story. I'd been doing, I'd been writing this case book on antitrust law while I was at the Pentagon. So when I talked to Jones Day about joining him, I said, look, I've done all this stuff on antitrust. I just don't want to do any antitrust work or anything else. And they said, okay, that's fine, no problem. First problem I got when I got to Jones Day was an antitrust case, and it lasted for 13 years.
Oh, wow.
So, but it was a good experience.
So that's something. So you're establishing yourself, you're a partner with Jones Day, you're doing all this good stuff. And then, you know, law firms are notorious for having anti-nepotism policies. But somehow, you and your father got together. Tell us about that.
Okay, in June of '46, the day I graduated from high school, he left the government and set up his own law firm. And initially it was 2 lawyers, and it was called Pogue and Neal, and in Washington. And they only represented airline clients because that's what he was familiar with. And it was an instant success. It was just, they were very, very fortunate. And so then about 1960s or 70, I guess it was in the late 70s, by that time he had 100 lawyers in his firm.
Wow.
And I was with Jones Day, Cleveland, and we had a little office in Washington that wasn't doing much. It was pretty dormant. And so he wanted to expand his firm beyond airlines. That he was worried that he only had a single field of practice, airlines, and he wanted to combine with a larger firm, or another firm anyway. And we had this little office that wasn't going anywhere, so we wanted to expand. So, and there were a couple of guys, there was a guy in Pogue and Neal who was a good friend of a Jones Day guy in Washington, and they started talking, and it just seemed like a natural combination. So we acquired him, his firm, and for a couple of years we operated under 2 names. In Washington it was Jones Day, Pogue and Jones Day, Reavis and Pogue, and in Cleveland it was Jones Day, Coakley and Reavis, and that was very confusing to clients. And so after a couple of years we combined the 2.
So how did you get around?
Oh, well, we had a strong anti-nepotism rule, but it only said that you can't hire sons of partners. It didn't say you can't hire fathers of partners. So we got a good lawyer to tell us that it was all right.
That's amazing. You got 2 brilliant lawyers that are figuring out a way to get you. That's hilarious. So then you became managing partner, and you really grew the firm.
Yeah, that was in 1984. It was because of Alan Holmes. By this time, well, he became the managing partner. I forget when it was, but it was like in the late 70s. But Alan, he was a brilliant lawyer, absolutely brilliant. But he had a disease, a paralyzing disease called Guillain-Barré syndrome. And usually people get that disease once and they either die or they recover.
Yeah.
But in his case, he was struck by the disease 5 times during his lifetime. It was a medical anomaly, really. And the 4th time was in 1984, and in 1983, I guess. And he was in London. He was president of the International Wine and Food Society.
Oh, nice.
And he was conducting business over there, and he got struck for the 4th time. And this time it was pretty serious. He was paralyzed from his neck down.
Jeez.
And he tried to carry on as managing partner for a while, but it just was too difficult. So he asked me to take over in 1983, I guess it was. And meanwhile, he was in London in the hospital for a long time, and we finally got him back to Cleveland, and he was in the intensified care unit at University Hospitals for 13 months.
Oh.
And while he was there, even though he was paralyzed from his neck down, he conducted an active legal business.
No kidding.
And, yeah. And he had,
Guy's amazing.
beg pardon?
He's amazing.
Yeah, it was. But he had tremendous guts, and he's a brilliant lawyer, and the clients loved him. One interesting sidelight, he loved martinis, and he got the hospital to agree to put a bowl of martinis up above his bedside with a straw coming down.
Oh, man.
Anytime he wanted a martini, he could just lean over.
Oh, that's great.
So that's when it happened.
So now you're managing partner, and during your term, you grew so big. I mean, hundreds of % in both number of attorneys and from your offices, domestic and worldwide now. Was that the plan, or did you need that to survive, or what was the story there?
Well, while I was managing partner, we grew from 300 to 1,200 lawyers. But the main thing was I could see that the legal practice was going to become international. At that time, there was only really one firm called Baker and McKenzie, which was in the international field. But I could see it was going to become international, so I set out to figure out how to be an international firm. And I asked two of our ablest partners, Dave Gunning and Dennis LeBar, to study how do we do this. I mean, we're here sitting here in Cleveland, and they did some study, and they came back and said, as a practical matter, you can't get there from Cleveland. You got to be in New York, or
Yeah.
the clients won't think you're serious unless you're in New York. So I set out to acquire a New York firm, and I spent a summer talking to various firms and mid-sized firms in New York, and we'd have wonderful conversations, and then we'd get to governance. And in our system, where the managing partner makes all the decisions, they just couldn't handle that there. Typically, we're run by committees, and I was getting pretty desperate. And then we stumbled across a firm. It was, frankly, not of the same quality that ours was, but it was called Surrey and Morse, and it was formed by two guys who had been in the State Department during World War II, and they had traveled all over the world. They had lots of contacts, and they had formed this firm which had maybe 100 lawyers, which had offices in Washington, New York, Paris, London, and Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And Surrey and Morse were about to retire, and they didn't have anybody they felt comfortable with turning it over, and so we acquired them in 1986, and that was our springboard to going international. They had, various lawyers in their firm had ideas of other places where they could be, but they didn't have the wherewithal to do it, whereas we did. So we often, and while I was MP, we opened offices in Hong Kong, Tokyo, Frankfurt,
Wow.
Geneva, several other places.
Wow. And that's one of the reasons you were inducted into Cleveland International Hall of Fame in 2015, for just really, when people said you can't do this in Cleveland, you went out and did it and made it international. I remember that night there were 500 people in the room at the Marriott, and Sanjeev Kapoor, your colleague, inducted you. That was a great night. Was there one particular event, or was it a trend, or how did you know it was going to explode internationally, or just from doing work every day and seeing?
Yeah, you could just sense it. There was more and more international transactions, and it just seemed to be inevitable.
Now the other thing is you expanded diversity-wise. I mean, with women, for example, you targeted seeking out after female attorneys and partners. Tell us, I think she's pretty historic. Naoma Stewart. Tell us that story.
Yeah. Well, I was about a third-year associate at the firm, and I was in charge of our library, the Cleveland office library. And in those days, there were no women in any law firm in Cleveland, women lawyers in any law firm in Cleveland. And this woman, Naoma Stewart, came because we needed a librarian. Our librarian quit, and I was in charge of hiring a librarian. And she came in. She had raised a family and then went to law school, so she was a little senior, but she applied for a job as our librarian. And I was very impressed with her. I thought she really showed a lot of skill, and I said, well, why don't you apply for a job as a lawyer? And she said, well, no women apply for lawyer jobs in Cleveland. And I said, well, let's explore it. So I went in to see Jack Reavis. He was our managing partner, and he was a tough old guy. And I gave him my pitch as to why we should break ground and hire a woman lawyer. And he said, well, look, Dick, you can have it one way or the other. We can hire her and I'll leave the firm, or you don't fire her and I'll stay.
Wow.
What do you want? Yeah, he was probably just kidding.
Yeah.
Still, but he said, all right, since you're pushing it so hard, we'll try it. So we hired her as the first woman lawyer in Cleveland. And then a few years later, she did a great job. She did blue sky work, meaning working with corporate commissioners in various states. And several of my colleagues said, well, why don't you see if you can have her be a partner? And so I go back into Reavis again. I tell him what I want to do, and he said, all right, she can be a partner now, get out of here. But so she was the first female partner in Cleveland also. And
that's huge.
Did a good job.
That's huge. And besides females, you recognize the need for looking for qualified Black and Hispanic and other minority attorneys. So you established a minority task force, hiring task force.
Yeah.
What brought that around?
Well, it seemed to me that there were some very able African American lawyers. And why don't we break a little ground and hire someone? I forget who the first one was. I should know, but he's it escapes me. And turned out to be a good decision.
And no one else was doing this stuff back then.
Not
so this firm in Cleveland, not New York, not DC, none of that. This firm in Cleveland is going international. They're attracting women and minorities and all that. That's pretty revolutionary.
Go against the grain.
So then, okay, we looked at that. That's the big picture. But you were in 1988, Cleveland Magazine named you the most powerful man in the city. And you are Mr. Cleveland. You've done so much over the years with civic groups, corporate, nonprofit, every board, every program, philanthropic, all that. Why? First of all, you're a busy attorney, you got a family, all this stuff. Why did you throw yourself into all this?
Well, when I was the managing partner, I realized that I had to organize my time, and so I decided that I'd spend 40% on bringing in business and servicing clients, 40% in managing the firm, and then 20% on outside activities. And I thought that would be good for the firm to have some outside pro bono and civic stuff. And so then at the end of every quarter, I'd have my secretary come in and compare what I actually had done against that rubric of 40-40-20. And if I got out of phase, I'd change my ways.
That's amazing. People are always saying how you're 16 to 18 hours a day working and all. I guess to do, and then the 40-40-20, that's an incredible amount of time. Is that something you recommend to people now, that 40-40-20 work well? You think others could do it, or they'd need to be Dick Pogue to do that?
Well, I was really fortunate in that in my prime, I could get by on 4 hours sleep. So
wow.
I was just pure luck.
So I could list, and we could talk about, whether it's one of the schools, Case Western or Akron, or, so many of the different companies, Key Bank and Continental, and all the philanthropic, the orchestra and the city club, and, starting what became Team Neo and all. But there was a lot of power back then, and Cleveland went through some bad days. We went into default, and because you were respected and people trusted you, you were able to get some of your fellow CEOs together, for this whole Cleveland Tomorrow thing, kind of rescue the city. Tell us a little about that.
Well, there's some history there that doesn't seem to be recognized much. I've never understood why it's not discussed. In 1950, Cleveland was still the 6th largest city in the United States. We had over 1 million population in the city itself. And but then in the 60s and 70s, we went downhill pretty fast for a number of reasons. One of which was air conditioning. Air conditioning came in after World War II, and it enabled manufacturing to be done in warmer climes. So some of the companies moved west and south, and but there are other reasons too. So then in 1979, I think it was, we elected Dennis Kucinich as the mayor, and he was a wild man, and he decided to declare default on some municipal obligations, and that we got worldwide opprobrium, and it really was the best thing that ever happened to us, because it woke up the business community, and the business leaders decided we got to do something about this. So there were two things that went hand in hand. This was about 1980, 1970. And when they decided to find somebody who could run for mayor, who understood business and the public-private partnership possibilities, and they looked around and they finally found George Voinovich. And George had been a deal lawyer with Calfee Halder, a law firm here, and he knew how to get things done and how to get things. And so they asked him, I think it was Del DeWint, who was head of Eaton, and others asked him to run for mayor. At that time, he was lieutenant governor in Columbus, and he was all set to probably be the next governor. But they talked him into it, that he would run as long as they would provide him support when he ran, and they did. A number of companies loaned executives to George as he ran for mayor. One of them, a friend of mine, the TRW stayed for 4 years, actually.
Wow.
But it was a tough race, and Kucinich was popular with a certain part of the population. And so George won, but not by a big margin. But then, as you probably know, he in those days, it was a 2-year term, and he ran 4 more times. So he was mayor for 10 years in the 80s, and he reached out to the business community and worked on the public-private partnership, and it was just a tremendous change in the way things got done, because business people responded and helped and loaned money and everything. The other thing was that the business leaders asked McKinsey and Company to study what's the problem with Cleveland? Why are we in this mess? And they studied it, and they came back and they said, well, one of the big problems is that you have this massive Chamber of Commerce. We used to be proud of the fact that we had 16,000 members. Every little mom and pop was a member. And they said, you're just too big and too cumbersome. You can't get anything done. You have too many factions. And what you ought to do is copy Pittsburgh. And Pittsburgh, they had a big chamber like we did, but they also had another group called the Allegheny Conference, which was the CEOs of the 50 largest companies in the Pittsburgh area, and those guys worked on the big issues of the day. And so we followed them and created Cleveland Tomorrow, which was like 35 top CEOs, and they never brought in a vice president or anything. Had to be the CEO personally.
Wow.
And they decided to just work on 1 or 2 priorities at a time, not try to do everything. And they decided that their number 1 priority was upgrading downtown Cleveland. It was in kind of disrepair. And so they poured money in and did a lot of things. And during that 10-year period of the 80s, you had the combination of Voinovich working with the private sector and the Cleveland Tomorrow, and everything that it could contribute. And that 10 years of the 80s was a great comeback period.
So this public-private partnership and some of these leaders, you and the CEOs and then George Voinovich were able to contribute to this, but you also saw the minority community and the value there, and you were founder and chairman of the Greater Cleveland Roundtable. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that was, trying to remember who it was, but there was an African American who approached me and said, we're not involved in the business community. We've got our own areas of activity, but we don't have any contact or relationship with the business leadership. And so we decided to try to form a coalition of not only blacks, but other segments of the community. And we called it the Greater Cleveland Roundtable. And it had businessmen, African Americans, other segments of the community. And I don't know if it's still going today, but during its period, it did a lot of good things.
You've had so many successes and awards and all, but I just want to ask you one interesting thing. When I think of you as a Cleveland Orchestra kind of guy, more than a rocker. But you were instrumental in getting the Cleveland, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame to Cleveland, right?
Yeah, that was. I knew very little about the orchestra. I'm not.
Oh, really?
Not an orchestra guy. But in 1983, we had a young guy named Mike Benz, who was the number 2 guy in the Growth Association, the Chamber of Commerce, and he said, what Cleveland needs is something that no other city has. A lot of big cities have baseball teams and football teams, but why don't we have a Hall of Fame to recognize rock stars? And, okay, we'll explore that. We had a Cleveland disc jockey named Alan Freed, who had invented the term rock and roll. And so we sort of built on that rock and roll terminology. And so we went up to New York, because that's where the music companies were headquartered, and proposed a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It happened that in that very same year, 1983, the New York music people were thinking of having a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, because rock and roll was having a bad name because of drugs in those days. They wanted to do something to upgrade the concept. But Cleveland, Ohio, it just didn't seem like a place to be. But we kept pounding away. We had British Petroleum was then a big company here, and the CEO of British Petroleum, Bob Horton, was a big believer in this, and he kept supporting us and going to New York and telling them how it ought to be in Cleveland, because we'd invented the terminology. And of course, they weren't paying any attention to us. But gradually, other cities began getting the idea, Memphis and St. Louis and San Francisco. And so they all were starting to urge the New York people to have a Hall of Fame in their city. And the New York guys didn't know what to do. So they finally decided, okay, we'll have a 2-day phonathon where anybody in the United States can call in and say it ought to be in Memphis, or it ought to be in St. Louis, or whatever. So we got our guys busy in the chamber and manned the phones and called up. And at the end of the 2 days, Cleveland had 27,000 calls. Number 2 was Memphis with 7,000. So the New York guys said, okay, we give up. It could be in Cleveland. So then we decided it had to be a joint venture between New York and Cleveland. And we formed a nonprofit board of trustees, and we argued about everything, just constant arguments. And but we gradually got the thing going, and we were very lucky. The leader of the New York group, believe it or not, was Jan Wenner, who was then head of the Rolling Stones magazine, and he was not a Cleveland believer, but he relied very heavily on a lawyer in New York, Ben Nadell, who was with Skadden Arps, a big firm. And we discovered that, so whenever we'd have something we wanted, we'd go see Ben Nadell and convince him, and then he would convince Jan Wenner. So, but it took 12 years from the time we got it, from 83 to 95, when we had the grand opening.
Oh, yeah.
That was a big day.
I remember making a lot of those calls myself back then.
Oh, yeah.
All that stuff.
Yeah.
So, you got a gold record out of this, huh?
I'm sorry?
Did you get a gold record out of this? That's the urban legend. They gave you a gold record for your work.
Oh, yeah, right, yeah.
Dick Pogue with a gold record for rock and roll.
I knew nothing about rock and roll.
That's hilarious. You know, you would think with the successes you've had that the powers that be, both on the public and private side, would look at some of these efforts and duplicate them and say, okay, we've got to work the public with the private, with the minority community, with all these things that worked over the years, you know, the round table and the public-private and getting some of this together. It doesn't seem like that's always happening. Is there any advice you would give to city leaders, business leaders and all to really get back to that push? You know, we had that nice resurgence and we want to get back to that.
That's pretty tough. We do have one thing going, which is good. The mayor and the county executive seem to get along very well, so that's a good start. But our business community is, we've lost some big companies, and that's hurt us. And I think that one idea somebody had the other day, I forget who it is, but he proposed that we combine 3 or 4 counties, Cuyahoga and surrounding counties, and rename it Cleveland, and then that would enable us to get more promotional kick out of the name, but it's going to be hard to do.
That's a tough one, yeah. So that's it.
See, Columbus, of course, they knew how to do it way back, and they combined all their cities into one big county and called it Columbus, and that was a winning strategy.
Louisville, Kentucky, Indianapolis.
Yeah,
you know,
that's true.
So that's on the professional and business and civic side, but I got to ask for personal advice of philosophy. You're not a kid anymore, but you're out there. I see you at so many events, and not as a bystander. You're taking notes, you're giving ideas, you're working on this. You seem to have more energy than certainly me, but people a lot younger than me, they're, how are you still, you must need a little more sleep now, or how are you doing it? Give us a secret.
Yeah, well, I'm 97, and I just, I'm slowing down, no question.
Oh, no.
But, no, I'm just very fortunate to be in Cleveland at a time of rebirth, and consider myself very lucky to have been there during that comeback period.
Well, we were really fortunate that you didn't become a sports writer, and that your colleague at Michigan got you here, and that you and your wife Pat, your beloved late wife Pat, decided to give Cleveland a chance, because that 5 years turned into what, 60-something there?
Yeah.
So you're still here, and we're not letting you go anywhere. So
Thank you.
this is you can now see why he's the legend, the legendary Dick Pogue, and Mr. Cleveland, and we appreciate your time today, and we're going to try to emulate some of your great philosophy and works. Thanks a lot.
Well, I'm greatly honored that you had the interview. Thank you very much.